I invite you to remain standing for the word of the Lord, and I'll dismiss the children K through grade 5 for Children's Church. Dan and Janet leading today, with Andy fulfilling our M4 6A. King Herod heard about this, for Jesus' name had become well known. Some were saying John the Baptist has been raised from the dead. Others said he's Elijah, and still others claimed he's a prophet. Like one of the prophets of long ago. But when Herod heard this, he said, John, the man I beheaded, has been raised from the dead. For Herod himself had given orders to have John arrested, and he had him bound. And put in prison. He did this because of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. For John had been saying to Herod, it's not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. So Herodias nursed a grudge against John and wanted to kill him. But she was not able to, because Herod feared John and protected him, knowing him to be a righteous and holy man. Together, when Herod heard John, he was greatly puzzled, yet he liked to listen to him. Brothers and sisters, the word of the Lord. Amen and amen. You may be seated. So the portion of the text that we did not read, but is also critical for you to know, is that Herod, in the interval between John the Baptist confronting him, hosts a big feast, and Herodias' daughter dances so provocatively that it gets Herod's attention, and he promises her anything she asks, and she asks Mom what she should do, and Mom says, go back to Herod and ask for John the Baptist's head on a platter. And thus ended the life of the prophet. Head to head with Herod. Selected lines from the poem If by Rudyard Kipling reads, if you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, if you can trust yourself when all men doubt you but make allowance for their doubting too, if neither foe nor loving friends can hurt you, yours is the earth and everything that's in it, and you'll be a man, my son, if you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs. As we just read in the text, although John the Baptist was a righteous and holy man, he lost his head. So why am I selecting this poem to introduce today's message? I do so to invite us to think about the story from its eternal perspective. From where John sits in glory today, would we not say it was actually Herod who lost his head in this head-to-head encounter? Herod lost his way because the web he wove to satisfy his sensual desires caught him in a trap. A trap that once he saw how he had been manipulated, he no longer had the moral courage to escape. He goes down in history as a man too weak to stand upon principle. He's forever known as a spineless, cowardly adulterer who buckles to the manipulative hate his wife has for a prophet, whom Herod acknowledges he knows speaks the truth. Just like the men recently brought down by the Me Too movement, Herod is a man with no moral compass, no convictions to govern his behavior. He uses his power to seek and achieve a few moments of sensual pleasure no matter who he needed to drug, manipulate, or destroy, contextualizing it a bit. But first, some background. King Herod's ruminations bubble up because he keeps hearing reports of a man named Jesus whose fame is rapidly spreading, and the reports sound eerily similar to what he used to hear about the man he thought he had permanently silenced. So when Herod wonders if maybe this man Jesus was actually John resurrected, he is essentially having flashbacks rooted in his guilt, which if you've ever been there is never a fun position to be in. Maybe Herod had heard Hebrew texts like Isaiah 40 saying that their God, the Hebrew God, and I quote, brings princes to naught and reduces the rulers of this world to nothing. No sooner are they planted, no sooner do they take root, than God blows on them and they wither, and a whirlwind sweeps them away like chaff. Maybe Herod had heard of the Hebrew God's accountability to rulers. Whether or not he knew these scriptures, he seems to intuitively sense that an accountability force was out there waiting to catch up to him. And of course, his sense was right. I believe one of the reasons God charges his prophets to speak truth to power is so that when God calls those who abuse their power to account, they can't claim they had no warning. So let's turn our attention now to the other actor in this sordid drama, Herodias. Herodias was obviously a woman of striking beauty. Historians paint her as regal and stellar, but her heart is clearly polluted as she waits for the right time to strike against her enemy. The reason she hates John the Baptist enough to plot his murder was because John confronted Herod over the fact that Herod had taken her as his wife. And the problem with Herodias being Herod's wife was the conditions that got her into that condition. Namely, Herod had divorced his first wife to steal away this gorgeous wife of his half-brother, Philip. Historians report that it was even worse, as Herodias was the daughter of another half-brother of Herod. So Herod lusted after and took on to himself as a wife Herodias, who was both his sister-in-law and his niece. And clearly Herodias likes the power into which she has married now that her first husband was pushed aside. For she plots against the one man of God courageous enough to confront with truth. Human nature being what it is, there were likely some under Herod who murmured in the background about the sordid mess of his life. There were likely others happy enough with his policies to blindly support him. We see that in the unfolding drama then with Jesus. Some likely applauded the beauty of his trophy wife, no matter how sordid her rise to power. But the prophet of God, John, spoke the truth, face to face with Herod, that it wasn't right when Herod flaunted the law of God to commit adultery against his first wife. And as God's mouthpiece, John goes head to head with power, no matter the risk entailed. In spite of the sordid details of their lives, to Herod and Herodias, John the Baptist is the troublemaker who just won't keep his mouth shut about their sin. So, as unlimited power is tempted to do, Herod used executive privilege to first slam John into jail, and then later to sign his order of execution. What we witness in this text is the ever-present struggle of truth versus power that unfolds generation to generation down through human history. And the consequences of Herod's compromises have driven him into a half-crazed state of mind. The fruit of his terrible choices leaves him haunted by the memories of his actions. As multiple power mongers have discovered through the ages, you can kill the messenger, but you cannot kill the truth of the message. That's why our American founders and numerous persons throughout our history have declared that freedom of the press is the most important thing to protect if we wish to remain a democracy. The message of truth must prevail, or trouble will multiply in a torturous life of its own. There's always a conflict between truth and power. What I wish more evangelical leaders today would recognize is that when we value and yield to truth, we don't have to use any power but the power of our witness to Jesus Christ. Trying to use moral majority political power only ends up compromising our Christian witness. When the Emperor Valens threatened the follower of Jesus named Eusebius with confiscation of all his goods in order to shut him up, threatened torture, banishment, and even death, this courageous Christian replied, "He needs not fear confiscation who has nothing to lose, nor banishment to whom heaven is his country, nor torments when his body can be destroyed with one blow, nor death, which is the only way to set him at liberty from sin and sorrow." A man aware of an eternal perspective. Eusebius was a man who understood that losing one's head literally was a better way to spend eternity than to lose it spiritually by capitulation, fear, or manipulation. There are times in every Christian's life where we face a choice between compromise and steadfastness. When John the Baptist found him at that place, he spoke up, he spoke out, and although it literally cost him his head, he is in glory today with the testimony recorded of Jesus, recorded in Luke 7, where Jesus said, "Among those born of women, there has not risen a man greater than John the Baptist." What a great character reference with which to approach God's throne. Among those born of women, there has not risen a man greater. Oh, how we need more courageous prophets like John the Baptist in every generation. Followers of Jesus, who, as recorded in Hebrews 11:25, choose rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. But let's name yet a complicating reality. Beyond the clear truth statements of the gospel, and beyond the moral standards fleshed out in the rest of the New Testament, it can still be a challenge to know how to apply truth in our modern world. I remember in the late 60s, when our nation, I was a young boy, and our nation was reeling with protests, struggling for racial equality. I remember hearing by actually a favorite uncle, a trusted uncle. I remember hearing in the barn his words to my father, his clear belief that Martin Luther King was a communist committed to destroying our nation, which at that time was a fairly broadly shared perspective by whites in power. A few years later, I was privileged to spend a day in the King Museum in Philadelphia. I can still feel in my spirit the disconcerting turmoil that rose within me as I read King's words, his speeches, and his writings, and realized that although the man was far from perfect, he certainly sounded exactly like the Old Testament prophets. I concluded that day that King was driven by such a love for our country, he was willing to call us towards our highest ideals, ones that confessionally were not yet being lived out, and truthfully still are not. And of course, now 40 years later, most in this community would agree with that assessment. Why do I tell you this? Not to turn you in judgment towards those who got it wrong, even in our faith community, our faith heritage. I remain gratefully a Mennonite pastor. I accepted God's call to come home and pastor this faith community. I tell you because of how it eventually shaped me. Namely, it helped me do what I believe is the task of every person, particularly young adults, who grows up in the church. At some point, we need to no longer simply accept blindly what we were told in our elementary Sunday school classes and around the dinner tables. At some point, we each need to do what Paul himself in the Scriptures commends his listeners for doing. Going home after his preaching, opening their Bibles, and digging for themselves to see if what they heard is true. A certain holy skepticism, if you will. And with the apostle, I beg of you that you do the same for me, as the one called to carry this weight week after week of doing my best to represent truth, knowing I don't always get it right. I do not want you to blindly, unquestioningly accept my best attempts to represent truth. In that growing up childhood experience, I also discovered that I could forgive and even appreciate my childhood role models who weren't always right. And I too, so that I too could be forgiven, knowing I too don't always get it right. It's as we embrace this journey towards maturity that we grow in humility, to still boldly share and declare the truth as we see it, but beyond the clear declarations of Scripture, to have a degree of humility in our application. What it also helped me not embrace fully was any one side in a raging debate, but to carefully and prayerfully be open to truths that I might hear from the perspective opposite of mine that would help my understandings go deeper. When our economy collapsed in 2008, I paid attention to which, because I'm not an economist, but I read broadly and I paid attention to which economists made which arguments on opposite ends of a recommended response. And then I watched over the years to see how quickly the one country versus another that applied this versus that, how quickly they recovered. Which predictions seemed to have been most right. That doesn't mean I now blindly accept every analysis they currently write. But it does mean I will more quickly defer to their expertise. And it means I will more deeply trust the presidents who put in places of influence advisors who were proven to be right versus those who were proven over time to be wrong. That's a way that I try to apply this principle in my own life. I apply the same principle to TV stations, to commentators, to other preachers, to faith traditions. The historical record now makes it clear, for example, that national leaders intentionally deceived us as a nation in getting into and staying in the Vietnam War. That does not mean we should despise and be critical of those who felt called to serve and served the best they knew how. But it does mean we should have a certain skepticism about leaders. Applying these truth principles, I pay attention. I try to which faith traditions back at that era of time became the blindly loyal voices of that march towards war, and which traditions raised caution and now decades later were shown to have been wise. More recently, the same principle caused me to trust some leaders more than others as we were being led into the Gulf Wars. And I will say that in my lifetime, I had never seen such a broad diversity and such a deep number of Christian leaders raising caution together. Even Christian leaders who were of a just war position, the voices raising caution about the march towards the Gulf Wars was the broadest, deepest voices of caution from the Christian community I've witnessed in my 63 years of life. And most people today would say we'd be better off if leaders had listened to those voices of caution. One of my deeply influential mentors, Dr. Kemmer, said to me when I was in my 20s, in war, the first casualty is always truth. My 40-plus years of watching the Herods of the world exert influence has led me to believe this is true. I want yet to make one final application. Although even Jesus was profoundly critical of both political and religious leaders, he wasn't paying Herod a compliment when he says, "Go tell that fox." What he also modeled and taught was that we should be loving and gentle, full of grace to those who aren't operating from immense power. Get this distinction. Get this distinction. Over and over again, Jesus models and teaches to be gentle and gracious, speaking truth out of a foundation of love to anybody and everybody. The only exception I find in the Gospels are those who are operating out of unlimited power, know it, and use it. The biblical